What role did United States Army intelligence services play in defeating the Nazis in World War II? How did Army intelligence begin monitoring the Soviet Union as the Cold War began? And what's the real story of Cold War spies versus pop culture movies and novels? For answers to these questions and more insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Thomas Boghardt about his new book, Covert Legions, which tells the story of how United States Army intelligence services guided and executed U.S. policy in Europe from 1944 to 1949. Welcome, Thomas, and thanks for joining me here today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. You know, it took me about 7 years to write this book.
Oh, wow.
And you're kind of living like a hermit. And it's great to be finally able to talk about it and, tell your listeners a little bit about what I found and why I think this is an important and, quite frankly, also fascinating subject.
Absolutely fascinating. We're going to get into some of that. But before we do, I just want to let people know who you are and what your background is. So Dr. Thomas Boghardt is a senior historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. Before joining the center, he served as the historian at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and as the Fritz Thyssen Fellow at Georgetown University. He is the author of numerous articles and books on intelligence in the 20th century, and he lectures frequently on this subject. Dr. Boghardt received his Ph.D. in modern European history from the University of Oxford. That's the one in England, isn't it?
That's correct.
Great. So, I want to start our discussion. I'm anxious to get into the material because I think it's really fascinating. But what am I missing about your background? Tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So I think you've touched on sort of the major milestones in my career. As you can hear from my accent, I'm German originally. I've lived here for a long time, though, and I'm a senior historian at the Center of Military History. I have had a very long interest in espionage. Don't ask me why. Probably just coming from reading spy novels. And I grew up late Cold War, so the Cold War was kind of still on people's mind. I did my dissertation in England on a topic of espionage in World War I. Later wrote a book about the Zimmermann telegram and the intelligence involved there. And then, as you mentioned, I joined the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C., and that was really a pivotal moment because when I did join that museum, that was in 2002, if I'm not mistaken, the Cold War was still very much on people's mind, and I had the great privilege of working at that museum with a number of board members and the director who had served for various intelligence services during the Cold War.
Oh, that's fascinating.
CIA, FBI, we had a retired KGB general on board. And talking to these people and looking at these artifacts there, it just really spoke to me. Mm-hmm. And it became a passion of mine. And so when I left the Spy Museum and joined the center, I kind of took this interest of Cold War with me. And and I think this is how eventually we ended up here at this desk talking about my book.
Right, and it's a thrilling book. Covert Legions is the title. The U.S. Army Intelligence in Germany, 1944 to 1949. So first of all, Covert Legions. I think it's a great title. Just explain that to folks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, we thought a lot about this title, and really, it's a fancy way of saying military intelligence, right? I mean, legions. That is an allusion to the Roman legions, military units of the Roman Empire. and the Army obviously is a military organization, and we think of the military as doing things very overtly. That's their job, but it's often forgotten. There's a covert part to it. In many ways, intelligence, all intelligence derives from fighting wars, learning about the enemy. And so this is what this title, this is how this title came to be. Subtitle, it covers 5 years from the moment that American troops entered Germany in September 1944. The military occupation began to the end of the military occupation in September 1949. So this is how the title tries to capture the content of the book.
Right, and intelligence, that is just an essential part of warfare. Even going back to Sun Tzu, he felt that spying and intelligence was one of the main principles.
Absolutely. You can go back as far in history as you like. If you look at the you mentioned Sun Tzu, obviously, great Chinese author on warfare and intelligence. But you find the same in Western literature. If you go back, the oldest products of Western literature, the Bible, the Old Testament, or the Iliad, you will find references to spies. Think about the Trojan horse. It's a piece of covert action, right? So this has always been around. Sometimes it's jocularly referred to as the second oldest profession, and it is still with us today. You're absolutely right. It's an essential part of a military. Goes beyond that, but those are the origins. It's always been with mankind.
Right, and then so intelligence has been around, from the founding of the U.S. Army and throughout World War II. But you're focusing on when the Army actually gets into Germany. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the beginning of Army intelligence with Germany. Describe what was happening.
Right. So obviously this is a broad field, and I try to capture that in the book. So when World War II starts, there was an Army intelligence organization, but it had to be revamped, it had to be reorganized, it expanded massively. Important to keep in mind that, especially in the European theater, the Army was really virtually the only American organization with an intelligence organization. So anything that was done in terms of intelligence operations in the European theater was conducted by the U.S. Army. When the Americans came to Germany in September 1944, they immediately needed to retool from simply, assessing the order of battle of the Wehrmacht of the German Army to anything that was required in the occupation, and that was denazification, for instance. Finding out the bad guys and removing them, exploiting. German technology. The Germans were very advanced, and we wanted to capture some of that stuff for ourselves. Placing capable administrators and reliable people in key positions, that type of thing. Finding out what the other allies, this of course was an alliance war against Germany. Finding out what they were up to in Germany. All these things are classic intelligence missions, and really simply by the fact that there was no other organization to do it, the Army took all of this on, which is why the subtitle U.S. Army Intelligence in Germany may be a little misleading. It could also be called U.S. Intelligence because the Army was virtually the only organization that had to deal with these multifarious tasks.
So I know there was the OSS, right? The Office of Strategic Services. So what was the difference in their role compared to Army intelligence?
Yes, very good question. So there was the OSS. The OSS was a service that did not report to the Army. It reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was founded really sort of as a, on the one hand, as a coordinating body. It was supposed to coordinate intelligence activities between the Army, the Navy, and the State Department. They had some intelligence functions, but it was also modeled after the Special Operations Executive in Britain, which was kind of a covert action outfit. They were supposed to blow up bridges and this and that. The main function of the OSS was when we did invade Europe, France, the OSS was supposed to work with local resistance groups against the Germans. The issue here was that, as you know, once Normandy succeeded, the German resistance in France folded. The Germans were essentially withdrawn back to Germany. So there was very little for the OSS to do. And then once we reached the German border, the OSS didn't really have assets there, and it really fell to the army to get the job done, if you like. So the OSS is an important organization, but I would say its importance is really in laying the groundwork and providing continuity for what then becomes the CIA.
All right, great. Yeah, so now where D-Day has happened, the Army and the Allies are on the continent. So what tools, what units, what type of people was Army intelligence using to do their work?
Yeah. So again, the title Army Intelligence obscures the fact that we're actually talking about a number of organizations. Every unit, almost down to the platoon level, had some sort of intelligence personnel attached to it, and then the higher you go, corps, division, army group, these units become bigger and more specialized. They did everything that you would expect a modern intelligence service to do. They did signals intelligence, so interception of radio signals. They had spies, especially once they entered Germany. The recruitment of locals that could perhaps tell, here's someone who really should be removed from office, or here's someone who, was an anti-Nazi and you should work with this person because he has good credentials, that type of thing. The most important function during the war, and you find that in the memoirs of generals who served, was actually the interrogation of prisoners of war. General Seibert, who was the G2 of 12th Army Group and then became the main Army intelligence chief in Germany after the war, he said that 70% of the intelligence that commanders needed came from prisoner of war interrogations.
Wow.
Yes, because there was a lot of it. Mm-hmm. It was timely. You captured someone, he could tell you, what had happened within the German armed forces yesterday or even today. And the army was very, very good at processing this multitude of information in a very quick manner.
Actionable information.
Exactly, actionable intelligence. Correct.
But how willing were the Germans to talk? So that the intelligence could be actionable. Who was doing the interviewing? How are they getting this information out of them?
Right. Of course, it differs. If you get an SS general officer, he might be a little less willing to talk than, a private 17 years who's just been drafted. The point here is, that you have a lot. You don't depend on one person or this. And even if one person gives you a piece of information that seems, not interesting in itself, if you put it together with 1,000 other pieces of information,
right.
You're kind of putting together a puzzle. That's one thing. And another thing is, and I know we'll talk about this more later, is that the Army made very good use of sort of the human reservoir of American society. They targeted for their prisoner of war interrogators German emigres. You had a lot of Germans, many Jews, who fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s, came to the United States, were then trained at Camp Ritchie in Maryland. This was the main intelligence training center, as POW interrogators. Then they came back to Germany. Of course, they spoke to the Germans in their own language. They could make them feel comfortable.
Right. And that cultural aspect. So they knew what they were talking
about. Exactly. They would, might just sit down and say, hey, let's talk about the Rhineland, or let's talk about Munich, or wherever. They go up. One of the best known of these people, of course, is Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, yes. He and his family fled from Bavaria, in the 1930s because of his Jewish background. He then became a prisoner of war interrogator. He spoke German like a native because he was a native, and he put these German prisoners of war at ease. They were just happy to talk. They were just happy to talk, and this is partly of why the POW interrogations were so absolutely valuable for the Army.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, so the Ritchie boys. So talk a little bit about the types of information that they got and how did it? We were talking about it being actionable history. What are some examples of how they were able to use that information to their advantage?
Right. Let me just preface it by saying, when we look at intelligence, of course, we always want to see, that flashy piece of intelligence that gave us that one piece of information that changed the course of history, right? And I hate to tell you, but that rarely happens.
Right. All right.
Intelligence, think of it like diplomacy, right? It provides a steady stream of information that hopefully will be integrated into decision making, and then will play their role. It's often hard to say, okay, here's a piece that change the course of history. But for instance, we can say now with certainty that we had a very good idea of the order of battle of the Wehrmacht.
And can you just explain that for some of our
Yes,
listeners who might not
absolutely. So
understand?
basically, it means the strength and the disposition, the organization of the German army. We kind of knew what type of units they had. We knew how they moved their units. We knew a good deal about the morale of their units, of their logistics, of their disposition. Although I should also caution that that's not the be-all and end-all. So if you think, for instance, about the Battle of the Bulge, this was the one major battle that the Americans faced when they invaded Germany in this winter of 1944 and 1945. It is often attacked as an intelligence failure because we didn't predict that attack. And I talk about that in my book. So my conclusion is that we actually had a very good idea of the type of forces the Germans had. We also knew they were up to something because they were moving stuff. We did not anticipate the attack because that would have required us to look inside the head of Adolf Hitler, and we couldn't do that. It's also interesting to see that the German generals themselves advised against an attack because it doesn't make sense. We have so few resources. Let's not waste them on that. That was our conclusion too. Now, then you have someone who is somewhat irrational and makes a decision anyway. Same with Pearl Harbor. We kind of knew something was up, but an attack on Pearl Harbor just didn't make sense from our point of view. That is the hardest part of intelligence. Nonetheless, we did have a pretty good idea of German strength, German's disposition. We were able, for instance, to assess that the German guerrilla movements, the so-called werewolf, once we looked a little bit more closely at it, was really non-existent. Would not pose much of a threat. And those types of things. So I would say look at intelligence at wartime or in peacetime as an important stream of information that needs to be integrated well, and then it can play a valuable role in decision making.
Right, and your book really highlights, how that happened, and I think there's a lot of lessons there.
I hope so.
Definitely. And then you talk about counterintelligence in throughout the book as well. Just talk a little bit about that. How does that apply to all this?
So intelligence, comprises the discipline of counterintelligence. We of course want to learn what our opponent is doing, and the opponent wants to learn what we're doing, and this is where counterintelligence comes in. The idea here is to deny him that opportunity, be it by identifying, arresting their spies, be it through communication security. That's a big problem, especially in wartime. Commanders and forces on the ground need to relay information fast. If it's sent over the air, as opposed to wired information, it can be plucked from the ether by the enemy, and if it's not encrypted, they can read it in real time. Incidentally, this is something apparently that's happening in Ukraine right now. The Russian forces, from what you read in the press, are not practicing very good communication security. Therefore, the Ukrainians often know what the Russians are up to. And
another reason why this book is so important, these lessons learned, you've got to keep applying them, and unfortunately for the Russians,
lessons learned or not learned, that is the question. Of course, that is frustration of the historian. We would like that to be the case, that the lessons are learned. And of course, that's also part of the mission of the Center of Military History. And you write this history, of course, they're interesting. But the key point here is there something to be learned in the future? In the case of Covert Legions and the Ukraine war, of course, one of the things that stands out is the cooperation between army intelligence and Ukrainian refugees in early Cold War Germany. You had a lot of Ukrainians fleeing from Eastern Europe because either they had worked with the Germans or they were afraid of the Soviets, coming to Germany, mostly Bavaria. And here the army and intelligence services worked closely with these people because clearly there was a commonality of interests there, right? And so this is something that in some way, all of a sudden, that seems very timely.
Yeah. So intelligence clearly plays a huge role in combat operations. I've talked about that. Now, the end of World War II comes in Europe, and now we've got the occupation. We've got, I guess, growing threats, you could say, from the Soviet Union. So talk to me about how Army intelligence, what was their new role?
Yeah. Think about it this way. Think about Europe in 1945. Picture a map of Europe in 1945. The Third Reich is dying. You have the Grand Alliance between the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States. And then fast forward 4 years, 1949, and think about the world then. And you'll see something, I think is unique in European and world history, such a dramatic change. Europe is then divided. You have an Iron Curtain. Germany is separated into two states. And the U.S. and the USSR are facing each other off, sort of on the brink of a Third World War. Much of this change happens or is triggered in Germany because here the two superpowers are facing each other. So for American officials in Germany, and the army again was the supreme political authority of the United States in Germany, it was a military governor, General Clay, has to deal with this enormous change, and they have to deal with it in a country that is virtually destroyed, where you have millions of people moving around, where the goals of the Allies are shifting, where the future is extremely hazy and unclear, and yet you have thousands of American troops there. It's vital to American interests. So the one thing that Clay, the governor, and the United States needs is information. What is actually happening on the ground? What's happening with these millions of Nazis that have disappeared? Are these people going to be loyal? Do we need to prosecute them? Are they going to come back? What are the Soviets up to? What are the Soviets' goals in Germany? Then more basic problems, hunger for refugees. So essentially, this is really about simply trying to get the information that American authorities in Germany and the United States need to devise a sensible policy. And that is a huge task indeed, and it really involves most aspects of life in Germany and Central Europe in the late 1940s.
Yeah. So this information that they're collecting, as you alluded to, it really helps to guide the decision-making in Washington, which is what intelligence is supposed to
guide and implement. It's kind of a both. It's both way. Let's just pick at an obvious example. And this is something that the book deals with extensively: is a changing relationship between the United States and the USSR. 1945, we are allies. People often forget that we were allies. The Soviet Union bled heavily in defeating the Nazis. And in 1945, I don't think anybody really foresaw this radical break that would occur. The idea was that Germany would be occupied jointly, it would be governed jointly, and we would together find a solution to this German problem. This was already the second time that Germany had, sort of involved the world in a world war. And then that changes over time, and we can discuss why. I think essentially you could say that the goals of these two countries were really incompatible. But but to kind of find that out, what are the Soviets actually up to? What are they doing in East Germany? So, for instance, they were very quickly building structures in East Germany, secret police units, concentration camps, a totalitarian political system that were totally incompatible with what we had in mind. How does this exactly look like, and what does that mean for us? So that's one thing. And then, of course, once the Americans devised policies to be implemented in Germany, you needed agents on the ground to implement those. Once again, intelligence comes into play because they're often the only ones who have the language experience, the cultural experience, the authority. You didn't want to involve combat troops in that. The military government was essentially administrators. And also, by the end of the occupation, 1949, there were twice as many army intelligence personnel than military government personnel. So that kind of tells you again how absolutely critical this large and very diverse army intelligence organization in Germany is for the implementation of American policy in post-war Europe.
So who were these Army intelligence agents that were on the ground? Were some of them the Ritchie boys? Were they just other American military?
So it's a very diverse group. The leadership, they're professional soldiers. The man who ran the show until, I believe, 46 or early 47 is General Edwin Seibert. He's a brigadier general, a very competent man who really set up this system. He's a top American intelligence officer in Europe. And he sets up the system that then stays in place for the next years. And many of his subordinate leaders are the same. The professional soldiers, they do not necessarily know German, or maybe not even have a profound background in intelligence, but they didn't have to be. They had to be good leaders and good administrators, and they were that. Then below that, you have a very diverse group. You do have a number of Ritchie boys, these German emigres who stay on. Unfortunately for the Americans, many of these get demobilized. Someone like Henry Kissinger, he was not a professional soldier. He did his time, and then in 1946 he came back to the United States, and the rest is history. We know what he pursued a somewhat different career, and so there were many like that. Unfortunately, so the army lost some real expertise. They certainly tried to get people through the draft to Germany who had somewhat of a German background, who maybe spoke the language. It does become a little bit of an issue because these young draftees, someone from the Midwest or wherever, may not be as attuned to operating in such an environment. But the army certainly tried through language training and also training in Germany to give these people some sort of background. From the late 1940s, they were also trained in Russian. But yeah, it's a very diverse mix of professional soldiers, draftees, and civilian contractors.
So let's talk a little bit about the tactics, techniques, procedures that they were using. Because when you say agents, and again, I alluded to earlier about pop culture spies. We think of James Bond or people like that. But what was really happening? What were these agents actually doing?
Right. So first, terminology. When I say agents, I'm referring specifically to members of the Counterintelligence Corps. This was the largest organization of the U.S. Army intelligence organization, as the name indicates. Originally, it was a counterintelligence organization, but once the Americans were in Germany, it quickly also became an espionage organization, simply because there was no one else to do the job. So the job of these people and the counterintelligence CIC personnel in the field had the title special agent. This is what they call themselves. And they did this through recruiting sources. So they would, let's say they were interested in what was going on at a local Communist Party meeting, West German Communist Party meeting. They would recruit someone, ideally a member of the party, who would attend this and then would later report back to the handling a special agent. So that was an important part of what they were doing. But then you had other organizations. And a big one was the censorship division. Remember, this was the military occupation, so we had every right to do pretty much whatever we wanted, and we used that with abandon. Any German phone call, any telegram that was sent, any letter could be read by us. And when I say by us, by the army, by the Americans, it was also important in the sense that at that time a lot of international phone calls were routed through Germany. Berlin was a major switch operation. So if the French ambassador to Moscow relayed information to Paris, guess where the switch station was.
Who was listening?
Absolutely. And so here you have another organization come into play, the Army Security Agency, which is the precursor of the NSA, which did all signals intelligence operations in Germany. And you had a number of other organizations as well. So when you ask about the techniques, I would say it depends. But the point here is this was all source intelligence. When we say intelligence, we often think espionage. Yes, that was part of it. But it was much bigger of that. And as a result of that, we had a very, very comprehensive idea of what was going on in Germany at all levels with the Germans, but quite frankly, also with our allies.
And where were these agents working? Was it just in West Germany, West Berlin, or was it in the Soviet zones as well?
Yeah, good question. So just in terms of organization, there were two headquarters. One was in Frankfurt, later Heidelberg, and the other one was in Berlin, depending on what organization you talk about. And Berlin, of course, becomes absolutely pivotal because it is a divided city. The Soviets in the east, the Western powers had the three sectors in the west. And the city itself is inside the Soviet zone of occupation. Yeah. Now, initially, that doesn't seem to be a big deal because we were thinking of, doing this jointly. But then as the Cold War really sets in, all of a sudden, West Berlin becomes strategically enormously important because all you have to do is take the metro, or S-Bahn as it's called in Berlin, cross into the Soviet sector, and there you are. And in East Berlin, of course, that's where you have all the Soviet headquarters. This is where you have the what later becomes the East German government. It was also relatively easy at that point to travel across the Soviet zone, and of course we were very interested what, for instance, how many troops did the Soviets have there, and we discovered they had up to 500,000 there, and then you kind of wonder, why do you need 500,000 soldiers for the occupation of a very small zone? So these were all questions that we asked, and those were the tasks of these various intelligence organizations.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's fascinating. So did that again? This information, did it raise a red flag? And how did the U.S. government respond to this information?
Yeah, great question. I think it's very important. One can really get wrapped up in these operations because they are fascinating. And then you have honey traps and these fascinating human stories. But ultimately, what you ask is exactly right. What was the upshot of all that? Did it make a difference? And I think it really did, especially in terms of the Red Army. If you look at our estimates of Soviet troops in East Germany. And now, of course, after the end of the Cold War, we actually know what the Soviets really had. And if you look at the Army intelligence estimates and the real numbers, you'll find that we were very, very close to the truth. If anything, interestingly, we underestimated the Soviets. The Soviets actually might have had a little more than we thought they did. So certainly it wasn't alarmist or anything like that. So the order of battle estimates that we produced were excellent, absolutely excellent. The question then becomes, well, what are Soviet intentions? And that's more challenging. We already talked a little bit about the Battle of the Bulge. And how do you assess someone like Joseph Stalin? This was basically, the Soviet Union was a one-man show. Not even Soviet officials in Germany might know what Stalin always wanted. But what I found fascinating is that throughout this period and continues, the Army and Army intelligence keeps telling Washington two things. One thing is, if there was a war, the Soviets would be totally capable of overrunning Western Europe within 6 weeks. And if you look at the weakness of the Western forces, that seems reasonable. However, the Army was also saying, and this was contrary to what a lot of alarmists in the United States were saying. You remember, McCarthy was just coming up, said, no, the Soviets do not actively plan for war. It might be that there's an accident. Stalin might play brinkmanship, and that might trigger a war. But as far as they could tell, the Soviets were not planning for World War III actively. And now, we're still debating what Stalin's goals were today, and that kind of shows you how difficult it is. But that seems to have been a very, very accurate assessment. And to the extent that American policymakers were listening to that, I think they were well advised.
Really, at this time, you mentioned the importance of Berlin. Berlin became very pivotal in the late 40s as we began the Cold War. And, before I get into Berlin, the Cold War, that concept, when would you say that began? And can you just, define Cold War?
Yes, I mean, Cold War, obviously the obvious explanation is the opposite of hot war. It's not a real war. It's sort of a competition between two systems, economically, culturally, ideologically, with spies, but stopping short of war. So this kind of unfriendly rivalry that you have between these two systems. Berlin. So when did it start? Depends on who you ask. I would say. I mean, personally, I would say President Truman delivered a speech in March 1947, in which he said the United States needs to help free peoples who are under threat by armed minorities. He didn't mention the Soviet Union or communists explicitly, but it was clear he was referring to them. So I think that was one major stepping stone towards the Cold War. The other one is, of course, the Berlin blockade in 1948, 1949. What happened was that, as I mentioned, West Berlin was essentially enclosed by the Soviet zone. Mm-hmm. And the Soviets decided to cut off land and sea access to Berlin for the Western powers. And the Western powers now the Americans first and foremost have to decide, what does this mean? Is this a prelude to war? And what are we going to do about it? What they do about it, they start this airlift, which provides, the city with everything it needs for a year. And that was a logistical miracle, really. But more importantly, from an intelligence perspective, the idea is, why is Stalin doing that? And what does it mean? Of course, a lot of people were thinking at the time, in Berlin in particular, this is a prelude to war. And of course, the Soviets could have occupied Berlin, at the drop of a hat. I mean, there was nothing that stood in their way. But once again, if you look at the assessments of army intelligence, they're actually not alarmist. They're very reasonable. They say, no, the Soviets, for one, they said the Soviets are not reinforcing their troops in the Soviet zone. They're moving them around to deceive us and make us think that they are.
That's their counterintelligence.
Exactly, but our assessment was that no, there's no increase in no augmentation in troops, and we also don't see that they're planning a war. So this was actually a very balanced and restrained assessment, and to the extent that we can now look into Stalin's thinking, many years later. That is true. I don't think he was really planning for war. He kind of wanted to see how far. Either force the Americans out or get some concessions for us. But this was not a prelude to war. And again, that was communicated to the Pentagon, and that did play a role in us not overreacting to what was going on in Berlin.
And did that make us feel more comfortable about doing the Berlin airlift then?
I think so, yes, because, Stalin didn't think this airlift would work. And quite frankly, initially, neither did we. Think about providing 2 to 3 million people from the air. I mean, it's even under today's circumstances, that's a major feat. Stalin didn't think that was possible. Once it turned out the Air Force was able to do that, yes, that was reassuring because we knew, as long as we can do that, we just have to keep doing it. And basically outlast Stalin. And this is exactly what happened in May 1949. Stalin basically said, what, it's going to reopen up, technical difficulties solved.
Exactly. Yeah. Because the just for some people listening who aren't sure, the Berlin Wall still does not exist. That doesn't come in until 1961.
That's a very good reminder. Yes, the Berlin Wall did not exist. As I said, if you wanted to go from East to West Berlin, all you had to do is hop on an S-Bahn. There weren't even any controls. It was not really a divided city yet. So there was a free flow of information, of spies, also refugees. I mean, if you didn't like it in East Germany, and many people didn't, all you had to do was come to Berlin, get to West Berlin, and then you were off the hook.
All right, and then last question about spies. So we had a lot of army intelligence, and I'm assuming our allied nations that were there had intelligence as well. Later on, some of these folks would go on to write books. So, what are some of the popular books about actual spies?
Yeah, one of the things that's really fascinating about this period is, of course, it is also the birth of the modern spy novel. Now, spy espionage, writing about espionage has been around for a long time, just like espionage itself. But the spy novel, as we know it today, was really born, I would say, in this time, 1940s, 1950s, especially in Berlin. Now, there were a number of authors who, they're mostly British authors, who actually were intelligence officers during the war, the Cold War, and then turned to writing. Ian Fleming is, of course, the one that we know best. He was an intelligence officer in World War II, and apparently he came up with all these crazy ideas, and his supervisors said, no, this is not going to work. But then he became a writer, and it worked very well there.
For James Bond.
For James Bond, exactly, and probably for Ian Fleming commercially, it also worked very well. But there were others, the most famous perhaps is John le Carré. He was a British intelligence officer who served in Germany in the early Cold War, and that certainly inspired him to write these books. And of course, they're fiction, books of fiction, but you actually do learn a lot about the time and intelligence. Graham Greene, another great British author, who served in intelligence during the war and wrote a number of spy espionage related novels. That are inspired by what was really going on. And what you take away from this is, how, fact and fiction sort of are intertwined, but also the central importance of early Cold War Germany and Berlin in particular. I mean, I would say that the single best novel, if one can say that, of espionage is The Spy Who Came In From the Coal, an absolute classic by John le Carré, which is set in early 60s Berlin and really captures this sort of the grittiness and the despair that the city experienced as really the fulcrum and the focal point of the Cold War. So it's kind of a two-way street between the real world of espionage and the fictional one.
And that's what I love about the book is it really it explains, I think, really well, how Army intelligence played a key role. But how some of these spies came into being, and as a fan of the spy novels and the spy movies, it was really interesting to balance these and to learn the real story of it. So I loved it for that and the history of that era as well. And it's fascinating. I told you we had a lieutenant general, retired Army lieutenant general, picked up the book. And he contacted us. He said he read it in one night. He could not put it down.
That's quite an accomplishment to read 500 pages in one night.
Yeah. And he called it brilliant. And I just think
it makes me very happy.
Absolutely. But it really is fascinating. And I didn't realize how much of the role the U.S. Army actually played in this. So I think last main question for you is really why, this is the beginning of the Cold War, this is 1944, 1949. So why is it relevant to people today? Why should people read this book?
I think for a number of reasons. As you said, you were surprised by the role of the U.S. Army. Remember that so a few things. Remember that the American national security apparatus, as we know today, was essentially set up by the National Security Act in 1947. So this is smack in the middle of this time. That act creates the Air Force, it creates the Department of Defense, it also creates the CIA. And of course, it takes a while for these organizations to come into being. So what then eventually emerges as the modern American intelligence community really was shaped by the Army at the time. It was shaped operationally by Germany. If you look at the biographies of many pivotal intelligence officials later in the Cold War, they all learned their trade in Germany and Berlin. This really shaped them. Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, Peter Sickle, many famous names. So, and again, it was the Army that created this apparatus. Another thing that struck me is how, of course, we're looking at the creation of West Germany, and Army intelligence was absolutely pivotal in helping set up this system. Hopefully make it democratic. One of the things I found is I wasn't aware of how many people, politicians, lawmakers who later became famous, well known, were actually agents of the Army Intel. I mean, the best known name is Willy Brandt. The man who later became mayor of West Berlin and chancellor of West Germany. We kind of know him mostly as someone who tried to work with the East, but he was a paid agent of the Counterintelligence Corps from 1948 to 1952 because he was an idealist, because he was anti-communist, and he saw an alignment between our interests and his. And there are many other examples. And then, of course, I already mentioned Ukraine early on. All of a sudden, some of the things that I found in my research are very relevant. Us working with the Ukrainians against the Soviets. Later on, we parachute Ukrainians from Germany. These are exiles into the Soviet Union. Of course, it's not exactly the same today. But there are all these ties that seem dormant, but all of a sudden seem very relevant again.
And it really separates theory from reality. And it just shows you that these give great examples of reality. Maybe taking theory and putting it into practice, but why understanding your past, why understanding what happened then is so applicable to today.
Yes, and of course, and that's what we hope to do with our books, not just mine, but all of ours. We write about wars that are past, but past is always prologue, and very often you can pick any war you like. The idea here is to learn from our success and failures, and hopefully apply that in the future.
As the saying goes, and I can't remember the name of the person who said it, but when we ignore the past, we're condemned to repeat it.
Yes, and unfortunately, that has happened many, many times.
Right. So I like to end each episode with my Whoa trivia. So it's what piece of trivia, what is maybe the most fascinating thing you learned researching the book, or something that's really fascinating about this era? What's your piece of Whoa trivia for this time?
Yeah, I think hands down, unidentified flying objects. So I as you know, it was in the papers. The Pentagon is currently is looking into this phenomenon, UFOs, and also sort of from a historical perspective. And so I spoke to them, and I said, "Oh yeah, I have a contribution." So when the Army came to Berlin, Army intelligence came to Berlin, they, as I said, they were involved in all aspects of German life. And all of a sudden, the head there, his name was Colonel Harry Pretty, was tasked to investigate the phenomena of unidentified flying objects.
Wow.
Yeah, which is, and of course, that fascinated me, and I looked into it. And in that case, it turned out, so the Germans in World War II had built a prototype of a what is it called? A one-wing airplane. These are sort of these
like our B-2 bomber.
Correct. That look very futuristic.
Wow.
And apparently, they did some test flights at the end of the war, and that's what triggered this notion of there are UFOs over Berlin. Of course, our interest was then more, did they actually complete this? Are the Soviets using it? And what happened to the people who built it? That was another interesting, important task, make sure that scientists who have knowledge that could be applied in war peace did not fall into the wrong hands. Werner von Braun is a great example, rocket scientist who then came to the United States and built the Apollo, which brought the first man to the moon. But the UFOs, that really struck me, and that was before it was all in the press. But as you said earlier, the past repeats itself, and here it does so in a very curious way.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I'd never heard that.
It's all in the book. Yeah,
it's all. Yeah, it's all. Yeah, it is, and it's a great book. It's fascinating history, but the relevance to today is just important. And before we close out, this takes us through 1949. Can we look to maybe another book in the future that covers more of the Cold War?
Yes, absolutely. Great lead up, by the way. Originally, when I started this book, the idea was to take the story to 1961. But as I got into it, I and the center, we decided there's just too much ground to cover, and the periods of the late 40s and 50s are really very different. So we decided to split this project. And this is volume 1 of what will be a 2-volume history of Army intelligence in Germany. The second volume, which I'm just actually completed the first chapter, will then cover the same geographical area, but from 1949 to 1961, the building of the Berlin Wall, which is often defined as the end of the early Cold War, and I would agree with that. So,
well, thank you so much, Thomas, for your discussion and insights today about Covert Legions and Army intelligence from 1944 to 1949. Terrific book. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this, and great talking to you.
You too. So now, if anyone wants to get a copy of Covert Legions and learn more about the Cold War or Army history in general, then I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. The book is available as a free PDF download. It can be ordered for free if you are part of the Department of Defense, or anyone can purchase it from the Government Publishing Office. And all the links to that are online at our website. So be sure you check it out at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And join us every week on this podcast for more in-depth discussions about Army history as we cover topics from all eras of the U.S. Army, examining battles, soldier experiences, equipment, weapons, and tactics. Thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds. And until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.